Story number 1. Trapped in the Shadows. The haunting photo we were never meant to take. A few years back, something truly unsettling happened to my cousin and me. I was 16 at the time, and it was the summer break. One evening, I decided to crash at his place for a fun sleepover. After more hours of binge-watching horror movies, we felt a surge of thrill-seeking energy. My cousin mentioned an old abandoned apartment complex nearby that was scheduled to be torn down in just a couple of days. The whole area had been fenced off, warning signs plastered everywhere. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to sneak in, thinking we'd capture some cool, eerie photos for laughs. The entire complex was tightly boarded up, doors and windows sealed like they hadn't been touched in years. My cousin, always the adventurous one, led us to a gap in the fence, and soon we were wandering through the shadows of the decaying buildings. As we roamed, we noticed one apartment on the 3rd floor with a window that hadn't been fully boarded up. From below, we could see into the dark room. My cousin snapped a picture with his phone, thinking it'd make a cool shot. Later that night, back at his house, we were reviewing the photos. When we got to the picture of the window, we both froze. In the photo, a woman stood inside, barely visible in the dim light. She was wearing a pale, torn dress, her skin deathly white, and her long, tangled hair covered part of her face. Her expression, it was blank, almost sorrowful. The thing is, there was no one there when we took the picture. Terrified, we rushed back the next day to check. Everything was sealed up tight. No possible way anyone could have been inside. To this day, we still have that photo, and we can't explain it. Story number 2. Obsessed and Unseen. The terrifying stalker who lured me in. This story isn't mine, but from my friend, whom I'll call Sam. It happened when Sam was just 11 years old. Living in a quiet neighborhood, Sam had always been popular at school, but there was one girl, Mia, who took her crush to disturbing lengths. Mia, who was 17, lived nearby and had known Sam for years, but she had grown more obsessed over time. At first, it was innocent. Messages every day asking Sam how he was doing, telling him to be safe. But it quickly turned eerie. Mia would text things like, "I see you're skipping lunch," or, "Your little brother's crying, you should check on him." Even though she wasn't there, Sam stopped using his phone, but the stalking didn't stop. Sam's mother worked late, so he often had babysitters. One day, a new sitter showed up. Mia, she acted friendly at first, but there was something off. She got closer to Sam's mother, almost too close. One afternoon, Mia approached Sam at school, claiming his mom had gone out of town for a week and wanted him to stay with her. Reluctantly, Sam agreed. At Mia's house, things turned sinister. Her parents weren't home, and Mia played strange games, like pretending they were married or blindfolding him for hours. 5 days in, Mia left for work and locked the house. Alone, Sam turned on the TV and froze. It was a missing child report, and he was the missing child. Suddenly, the TV clicked off, and Mia was standing behind him with the remote. Panicking, Sam screamed and bolted for a window. Luckily, a couple passing by heard his cries and called the police. When the authorities arrived, they found Sam bound and blindfolded in Mia's room. She was taken away, but the memory of her obsession still haunts Sam to this day. Story number 3. The Nightwalker, a stranger in the shadows. About 6 years ago, I lived in a quiet suburb in Canada. Being a night owl, I often found myself restless after my family went to bed. To clear my head, I took long walks around the neighborhood, enjoying the stillness of the night. For years, I wandered the empty streets without fear. Nothing ever seemed out of place. That all changed on a cold Thursday morning. Around 1:30 a.m., I was walking near a small, rarely used park, a few blocks from my home. It was dead quiet, with no cars, no people, just me. As I turned down a dimly lit street, I noticed something strange. At the far end of the street, I saw a figure. It was a man. But he wasn't just walking, he was dancing. His movements were slow and deliberate, like a waltz, but with a weird, jerky stride. He danced straight toward me. At first, I thought he was drunk, so I moved to the edge of the sidewalk to let him pass. But the closer he got, the more unsettling it became. He was tall, unnaturally thin, wearing an outdated suit. As he neared, I saw his face clearly. His eyes were wide, staring off at the sky, and his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, the kind of smile that sends chills down your spine. I quickly crossed the street, my heart racing. When I looked back, he had stopped dancing. He stood perfectly still, one foot in the road, staring directly at me with that same eerie smile. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. When I glanced back a second time, he had disappeared. Relief washed over me until I saw him again. This time, he was crouching in the shadows, still watching me. I ran. I don't know how far or how fast, but I didn't stop until I reached my house. Even now, years later, that haunting smile follows me in my nightmares, as if he's still out there, waiting. Story number 4, The Haunting Photos, a cleaner's chilling discovery. In the early 90s, my aunt, Rena, worked as a house cleaner in a small New Zealand town. Most of her jobs came through word of mouth or flyers in local shops. One day, she received a call from an elderly woman asking her to clean an isolated farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The woman's voice seemed frail, and she gave Rena a long list of unusual instructions, including strict times to arrive and leave. Despite the oddness, the pay was generous, so Rena agreed. On a chilly Wednesday morning, Rena drove out to the farmhouse. It was eerily quiet, with no sign of anyone nearby for miles. The house itself was old and creaky, standing alone in the middle of a vast, barren field. As she started cleaning, Rena felt an unsettling tension in the air, like she was being watched. About an hour in, she heard the back door creak shut. Startled, she checked outside but found no one, and there were no other cars on the property. Nervously, Rena resumed cleaning, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. When she reached the last room, a dusty, dim bedroom, what she found sent her heart racing. Spread across the bed were dozens of black and white photographs. As she examined them, her blood ran cold. Each photo was of her, cleaning other homes, getting out of her car, even through the windows of her own house. Terrified, Rena grabbed her things and fled the house, calling the police as she sped away. The woman who hired her claimed it was a break-in and denied knowing anything about the photos. The investigation led nowhere, but Rena was left with a deep fear that followed her for years. Shortly after, she moved to a different town, leaving the memory of that farmhouse behind, though the images still haunt her dreams. Story number 5, The Stranger Under My Bed, a chilling first apartment experience. Just over a year ago, I moved into my very first apartment, a small unit in a quiet neighborhood. Excited about my new place, I was in the middle of unpacking when something terrifying happened that I'll never forget. One evening, after running downstairs to get my mail while chatting with a friend on the phone, I returned to my apartment and casually sat on the bed to open my letters. In the middle of my conversation, I dropped my phone on the floor, and as I reached to grab it, I saw something that made my heart freeze. There was a person lying under my bed. The figure was motionless, facing away from me. My mind raced, but I fought to stay calm. In the most normal voice I could muster, I told my friend, "Hey, I dropped my phone. I'll call you back after I shower." Keeping my composure, I walked into the bathroom, locked the door, and turned on the shower to mask my next move. Then, I climbed out the window, heart pounding, and called the police. They instructed me to stay across the street and keep an eye on my building. I watched anxiously as the police arrived. A few minutes later, they emerged with a disheveled man, thin and pale, clutching one of my kitchen knives. Apparently, he had slipped into my apartment while I was getting the mail and had been waiting for me to come back. That night left me shaken, Chris. I never imagined my new home would become the scene of such a nightmare. The thought of what could have happened still haunts me. Since then, I have been extra careful every time I step through my front door, always checking twice. Story number 6, The Man in the Mask, a terrifying night in the snowstorm. When I was 22, my boyfriend and I decided to stay at my family's remote cabin during a heavy snowstorm, surrounded by nothing but dense forest. The only thing standing between us and the elements was an old wooden door, barely held shut by a broken lock and a few bricks. Late that night, while we were curled up on the couch, my boyfriend suddenly shook me awake, claiming he heard something outside. I brushed it off, assuming it was just an animal wandering through the woods, but then I heard it too. Faint noises coming from the shed. My heart skipped a beat. I muted the TV, and after a tense silence, I gathered enough courage to peek outside. There in the deep snow were fresh footprints. They led from the shed straight to the back of the cabin. I rushed to the window, only to be met with a sight that still sends chills down my spine. A man in all black, wearing a featureless white mask, just standing there, staring at us through the glass. Panic surged through me. I grabbed an old hunting rifle from the closet, barricaded the door, and dragged my boyfriend into the bedroom. Moments later, the silence was shattered by loud, deliberate bangs on the front door. He was trying to get in. We stayed hidden, hearts racing, hoping the makeshift barrier would hold. After what felt like hours, the banging finally stopped. We didn't dare move until morning. At dawn, we cautiously opened the door to find a new set of footprints leading back into the woods. We never found out who the masked man was or what he wanted, but that night left a permanent mark on me. The thought of his cold, empty gaze haunts me to this day. Story number 7, The Stranger in Grandma's House, a close call with death. A couple of years ago, I used to visit my grandpa's house daily to help him with chores. One afternoon, I arrived as usual, but something immediately felt off. The front door was unlocked, which was strange because Grandpa always kept it bolted. As I stepped inside, I heard movement upstairs, drawers opening and slamming shut. Assuming Grandpa was in his room, I called out to him. Suddenly, I heard the bedroom door slam shut. Before I could investigate, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Grandpa, telling me he'd be home late because he was at his weekly poker game with friends. My heart dropped. Whoever was upstairs wasn't him. I grabbed a kitchen knife and called 911, whispering to the dispatcher that there was an intruder in the house. Minutes later, the police arrived, storming up the stairs. As they approached the bedroom, a gunshot rang out, shattering the tense silence. It turned out the intruder was our next-door neighbor, a man I had known my entire life. He had broken in, armed and desperate to rob the place, completely unaware that I had walked in on him. If I had opened that door, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. The encounter left me shaken, knowing how close I came to confronting someone so dangerous. I'll never forget that cold feeling of dread and relief that day, my life had been spared by a simple phone call. Story number 8. The Man in the Closet. A dinner night turned nightmare. One evening, my husband and I came home from a quiet dinner to find our front door slightly ajar. I immediately felt a chill run down my spine. My husband told me to wait outside while he rushed upstairs to grab his shotgun. Determined to check the house, he went room by room, thoroughly searching, but everything seemed untouched. The police arrived shortly after and found no signs of forced entry or anything amiss. With no answers, we tried to put the unease behind us and went to bed. A few hours later, I was jolted awake by a scream, my own. I had opened my eyes to see a shadowy figure staring at us from the closet. My heart pounded as I realized we had forgotten to check there. My husband quickly grabbed his shotgun and yelled for the man to come out. Instead of complying, the intruder flung open the door and made a frantic dash for the front door, vanishing into the night before we could react. We were left in stunned silence, knowing that someone had been hiding just feet away from us the entire time. I still can't shake the feeling of how close we came to something far worse. That night changed our sense of security forever. Story number 9. Eyes in the Dark. A year of fear. About a year ago, I began experiencing unsettling events in my childhood bedroom at my parents' house. It all started one night when I heard the ominous creak of my closet door. Cautiously, I opened it, finding nothing but my clothes hanging silently. I shut the door tightly, dismissing it as my imagination playing tricks on me. The following evening, the creaking returned, followed by strange noises from the air ducts above, like something was crawling through the dark. I brushed it off as the house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, as I lay in bed, I noticed the closet door had creaked open again. I mustered the courage to check, but once more it was empty. My heart raced as I turned to look at the air vent, only to be met with a pair of cold, unblinking eyes staring back at me. Panic surged through my veins, and I screamed. But when I ran to my parents' room, they dismissed my fears as mere nightmares. Days turned into weeks, and the occurrences only escalated. Sometimes I could hear faint whispers coming from the vents, chilling me to my core. My parents insisted I was imagining things, but I knew I wasn't alone in that room. Eventually, I decided to sleep with the light on, but the feeling of dread never faded. To this day, I can't shake the memory of those eyes watching me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for a moment when I might be too tired to notice. I left home for college, but I still feel a chill whenever I think about that room. Story number 10. The Watcher of Silver Lake. I live with my family in a secluded cabin in the Poconos, not far from a serene lake where we often enjoy summer afternoons. Last Saturday, while my kids splashed joyfully in the water, I spotted something unusual, a dark, round shape drifting toward them. Panic surged through me as I rushed to pull my children out of the lake. But when I turned back, the object had vanished without a trace. Feeling unsettled, I kept the incident to myself, not wanting to alarm my wife or the kids. Later that night, driven by an uneasy feeling, I grabbed a flashlight and returned to the lake, determined to uncover what I had seen. The night air was still, but the silence was shattered by a sudden, powerful splash. My heart raced as I swung the beam of light around, and what I found made my blood run cold. Emerging from the dark water was a figure, tall and humanoid, but grotesque. Long, tangled hair hung in front of its face, obscuring any features. It stood motionless, water dripping from its pale skin, fixating on me with an unsettling intensity. Terrified, I dropped the flashlight, the beam flickering out as I sprinted back toward the safety of the cabin. The eerie sensation of being pursued lingered as I locked the door behind me. I haven't mentioned the encounter to anyone, fearing it would only spark more dread, but each time I hear the wind rustling the trees or the lake lapping against the shore, I can't shake the feeling that it's still there, lurking just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share.
The story number 1. The Cursed Figurine, a Haunting. That still lingers. 7 years ago, during the heart of winter, something happened that changed my view on the unexplained forever. It was late December, a few days before Christmas. The snow had blanketed our quiet suburban neighborhood, and the streets were deserted. My cousin Jenna and I were in my parents' living room, lounging by the fireplace after a long day of holiday prep. My younger cousin Zoe was only 5 at the time and had left her new porcelain figurine, a strange gift from our distant relative, lying on the coffee table. The figurine was unsettling from the moment I saw it. It had these piercing glass eyes that followed you across the room, a cracked, expressionless face, and a tattered dress that looked far too old for something brand new. Jenna hated it. She told me from the start that she didn't trust that thing, often throwing it into random corners of the house just to get rid of it. I didn't mind it as much, but I could see why she was freaked out. That night, the air was still, except for the occasional gust of wind shaking the windows. The rest of the house was silent. Jenna was typing away on her laptop, and I was lost in my thoughts, staring at the fireplace. Zoe's figurine sat on the table, face down, as if discarded carelessly. Suddenly, there was a faint noise, like someone dragging something heavy across the snow outside. I thought I heard a man muttering. I glanced over at Jenna. "Did you hear that?" I asked, breaking the silence. She barely looked up. "Probably just the wind or the neighbors clearing snow," she shrugged, but I could tell she didn't believe it. I tried to brush it off, but the sound grew louder. This time, it wasn't just dragging. It was the sound of heavy breathing, hoarse and rasping, like someone struggling to speak. I felt a chill run down my spine. I got up, pulling back the curtains to peek outside, but there was nothing. Just the eerie glow of the streetlights reflecting off the snow. The neighborhood was completely still. "There's no one out there," I said quietly, but even I could hear the tremor in my voice. Jenna didn't respond, though her eyes had drifted back to that cursed figurine. Just as I sat back down, the whispers started again. Only this time, it wasn't just one voice. It sounded like a child and a woman, both speaking in hushed but urgent tones. The figurine, still lying face down, seemed to command Jenna's attention more and more. "It's that thing," she muttered, finally breaking her silence. "Come on, it's just a stupid figurine," I said, more to convince myself than her. I picked it up, and immediately something felt wrong. It was heavier, far heavier than it had been earlier. And as I turned it over, its eyes, those cold, soulless glass eyes, stared back at me, wide open. My heart nearly stopped. "Jenna, this thing doesn't have any batteries, does it?" She shook her head. "I told you there's something wrong with it." Against my better judgment, I placed it back on the table. But as soon as I sat down, the rasping breath returned. Closer this time, like someone was standing right behind me. "I'm done with this," I said, standing up. "I'm going to check the backyard." As I moved toward the kitchen, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The figurine. It had moved, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. Panicking, I grabbed it again, and its weight felt almost unbearable now, like it was filled with something far heavier than porcelain. And then I dropped it. Its eyes blinked, not like a doll with mechanical eyes. No, it was slower, deliberate, almost human. Jenna didn't hesitate. She snatched the figurine off the floor and threw it down the basement stairs with force, slamming the door shut behind her. "That thing is never coming back up here," she said, trembling. We never spoke about it after that night. My younger cousin Zoe never asked about her figurine, as if she'd forgotten about it entirely. But I didn't. A few weeks later, while helping my mom in the basement, I saw it again, just lying there on the top step. But this time something was different. It wasn't cracked. It wasn't broken from the fall. It just lay there, watching, waiting. I didn't even think. I kicked it down the stairs as hard as I could, and I never went back into the basement after that. The story number 2. The knock at the window. On a freezing December night, I found myself curled up with a book in my cozy suburban home. It was one of those houses nestled on a quiet street, surrounded by woods, with hardly any neighbors in sight. Living alone, I never bothered with curtains in my bedroom, which sat on the ground floor. I loved waking up to the soft rays of sunlight filtering in each morning. But that one night made me question my decision forever. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night and turned off my reading lamp. The house fell into complete silence. That was until I heard a soft, unmistakable tap on my window. It was subtle, like the sound of a knuckle gently rapping against glass. My back was to the window, and for a moment, I tried to convince myself it was just a branch brushing against the side of the house. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't nature. It was someone or something outside. My heart raced as I strained to stay still, not wanting to acknowledge the terrifying reality. Then it happened again. Another distinct knock. This time there was no mistaking it. A cold fear crept over me as I realized someone was tapping on my bedroom window. I clenched the blanket tighter, hoping if I stayed quiet long enough, they would get bored and leave. But the knocks kept coming. A third and then a fourth. Each one grows in intensity. I couldn't bear it anymore. Steeling myself, I turned towards the window, ready to confront whoever or whatever was out there. But what I saw was far worse. Just as I glanced over, a dark, shadowy figure darted beneath the window, vanishing from sight. Every ounce of courage drained from me, and I bolted out of the room. Shaking, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher assured me an officer would arrive in 10 minutes, but even that felt like an eternity. As I paced around the kitchen, trying to steady my breathing, something caught my eye. Standing at my kitchen window was a figure watching me. Before I could fully register it, they were gone. Then my phone rang. It was my neighbor, the only one within shouting distance. His voice trembled as he told me he had seen 3 people in black creeping around my property earlier that evening. One of them held something shiny and sharp. Before I could process what he said, the knocking began again, this time at my front door. It was slow and methodical, as if they were trying to drive me insane. Just as panic threatened to consume me, I heard loud banging and a shout, "Police!" The officers arrived just in time, but the mysterious figures had vanished into the woods, leaving no trace. I never found out who they were or what they wanted. But the very next day, I bought heavy blinds for every window in my house. The story number 3, The Watcher in the Shadows. When I was 13, my parents had recently separated, and I was living with my mom in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Being an only child, I spent a lot of time by myself, except for the occasional time hanging out with other kids from the street. One of those kids was named Jason, who lived a few houses down. I met him one afternoon while skateboarding, and he invited me over to play video games. He was 17, much older than me, but he seemed friendly at first, so I didn't think much of it. We hung out a few times, but I soon realized that Jason was different. He had an intense energy, like he was always wired or agitated. He'd call me constantly, and if I didn't pick up, he'd leave irritated voice messages, sometimes calling 4 or 5 times in a row. I tried avoiding him, but my mom, thinking it was harmless, always encouraged me to hang out with him, even though I told her something felt off. One day, Jason insisted I come over to his house again, but this time I had a bad feeling about it. I reluctantly agreed, not wanting to seem rude. As soon as I stepped through the front door, I was hit by a putrid smell. The place was a disaster. Dirty clothes scattered everywhere, weird stains on the walls, and broken bottles littering the floor. It was like something out of a nightmare. Then, out of nowhere, this hulking man stepped into the room. His presence was overwhelming. He had a mean, heavy stare that made my stomach drop. Jason casually introduced him as his father. The man gave me a cold grunt before disappearing into another room, but that was enough to make my skin crawl. I wanted to leave immediately, so I made up some excuses about needing to go home for dinner. Jason's expression shifted from friendly to dark in an instant. His face twisted with this strange, unsettling anger. He didn't say a word, just stared at me as I hurried out of the house. Back home, I felt uneasy. My mom had left a note saying she'd be working late. Alone in the house, I tried to distract myself by checking my emails, but instead of finding the usual stuff, I saw 5 new emails, all from an address I didn't recognize. jasonhunt24@something.com. My heart sank. I never gave him my email. The subject lines were terrifying. One read, "You shouldn't have left." Another said, "I know where you are." And the others were filled with threats and profanity. Shaking, I went to call my mom, but then I heard it. The sound of something moving outside. I peeked through the blinds and nearly screamed. Standing in the bushes, staring right at me, was Jason's father. He was just watching. I immediately called the police. By the time they arrived, Jason's dad had vanished. My mom rushed home after hearing what happened, and the next day we filed for a restraining order. I never saw Jason or his dad again, but the fear still lingers. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. This collection of 10 eerie stories takes you into the heart of fear, where ordinary events turn into chilling encounters. Each tale unravels a unique mystery, drawing readers into a world where the line between reality and terror blurs. From unsettling strangers to dark secrets, these stories explore moments of suspense that will leave you questioning what's lurking in the shadows. Prepare for a gripping journey through 10 unforgettable, spine-tingling experiences. The story number 1. Unexpected Visitor. It was a chilly autumn evening when Sarah settled into her cozy living room, enjoying the crackling warmth of the fireplace. Her kids were already asleep upstairs, and her husband was out of town for work. She loved these rare, quiet moments, the house wrapped in a peaceful silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves outside. Just as Sarah was about to pour herself a glass of wine, there was a knock at the door. It was strange. Nobody ever visited this late. She hesitated for a moment, glancing at the clock. It was almost 10 p.m. Maybe it was a neighbor in need of something? Curiosity getting the better of her, Sarah walked to the front door and peeked through the peephole. A woman stood there, shivering in the cold, her face partially hidden under a hood. Sarah's heart sank. The woman looked vaguely familiar, like someone she'd met once at a friend's gathering years ago. Without thinking too much, she unlocked the door and cracked it open. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked cautiously. The woman smiled faintly, her eyes darting around nervously. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm a friend of your mom's. She asked me to drop something off." Sarah's stomach tightened. Her mom lived out of state and rarely sent anything. Still, the woman looked harmless enough, her small frame bundled in layers of clothing. Sarah reluctantly opened the door wider. Before Sarah could react, the woman pushed her way inside, slamming the door behind her. Sarah's heart raced as the woman stepped forward, her smile twisted into something menacing. "I didn't come here to drop something off," she whispered, her voice low and chilling. Panicking, Sarah backed away, her eyes searching for anything to defend herself. The woman's eyes gleamed with a strange intensity, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She took another step forward, and that's when Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, her neighbor Mark coming to check on her. The unexpected visitor froze, hearing the footsteps too. Before she could act, Mark's knock interrupted the eerie tension. With a look of frustration, the woman bolted for the back door and vanished into the night. Mark's timely arrival saved Sarah from what could have been a much darker fate. But the identity and motives of the woman remained a mystery, haunting Sarah for years to come. Story number 2. Grandmother's Cold Revenge. It was a bitterly cold winter evening when Margaret, an 80-year-old grandmother, began her usual walk home from the town's community center. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she shuffled down the dimly lit sidewalk, her breath visible in the freezing air. Despite her age, Margaret was sharp and vigilant. A widow of many years, she prided herself on her independence. But that night, something was different. As she rounded the corner near her house, she felt it. Someone was behind her. Margaret's heart raced, though she kept her pace steady, refusing to show any sign of fear. The footsteps quickened, growing louder with each step. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw a shadowy figure moving toward her. Her hand tightened around the strap of her purse. But more importantly, it found the familiar grip of the small .38 revolver tucked away in her coat pocket. A gift from her late husband, who had always insisted on her being able to protect herself. The stranger's voice rang out behind her, rough and menacing. "Give me your purse, lady." Margaret didn't hesitate. She turned sharply to face the man, his features obscured by the hood of his jacket. He was younger, stronger, but he underestimated her. "I don't think so," she said, her voice cold and steady. Before he could react, she raised the gun and fired. The blast echoed down the empty street. The man stumbled back, clutching his arm as blood seeped through his jacket. He fell to the ground, groaning in pain. Margaret didn't move for a moment, watching as the reality of what she had done settled in. But she didn't feel guilty. She felt justified. This man had chosen her as his victim, but he had no idea that this grandmother wasn't an easy target. The police arrived shortly after, and the man was taken into custody. He survived the gunshot wound and was later sentenced to prison for attempted robbery. For the rest of her life, Margaret never regretted what she did that night. "I didn't seek revenge," she would say, "but if you come for me, you'd better be ready to face the consequences." Story number 3. The mysterious dark shiny black SUV was a quiet Friday night when Emma, a 19-year-old college student, was babysitting for the Johnson family in their peaceful suburban neighborhood. The kids were fast asleep upstairs, and Emma settled into the living room couch, scrolling through her phone. She glanced at the clock, 10:45 at night. The parents weren't due back for another hour. Suddenly the house phone rang, startling her. No one ever called the landline. Hesitant, she picked up. "Hello?" she said, her voice soft. No one answered, just the sound of shallow breathing on the other end. She quickly hung up, dismissing it as a prank call. But something about the silence that followed felt eerie, unsettling. She peeked through the curtains and noticed it for the first time. A dark, shiny black SUV parked across the street, engine idling, headlights off. At first, she thought nothing of it. People sometimes pulled over to take a phone call or check their GPS. But as the minutes ticked by, the car didn't move. A strange unease settled in the pit of her stomach. Why was it just sitting there watching? Emma tried to shake off the growing paranoia. She turned back to her phone, but now her thoughts were racing. The quiet street, the dark night, the parked SUV. She glanced outside again, this time noticing a figure in the driver's seat, barely visible in the dim light. Her heart began to pound. She texted Mrs. Johnson. "Is anyone expected to come by tonight? There's a car parked outside." No response. Suddenly, the SUV's headlights flicked on. Emma froze as the vehicle slowly pulled forward, crawling up the street. But just as it passed the house, it made a sharp U-turn and parked again. Closer this time. Emma's pulse quickened. She grabbed her phone and called 911. "There's a suspicious car outside and I'm babysitting 2 kids," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It keeps moving up and down the street." Within minutes, police cars pulled up, but by then, the dark, shiny black SUV was gone, vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. The officers took her statement, reassuring her it was probably nothing. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that it had been something. A warning, a threat, something far more sinister. For weeks, she couldn't forget the glowing headlights and the lingering presence of the mysterious, dark, shiny black SUV. Story number 4. The Man in the Bedroom. It was a stormy night when 7-year-old Lily woke up to the sound of thunder rumbling through the house. Lightning flashed outside, casting eerie shadows on her bedroom walls. She turned over in bed, clutching her stuffed bear tighter, hoping the storm would soon pass. But something else was bothering her, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. Lily's room felt unusually cold, and she sensed she wasn't alone. Her heart raced as her eyes darted to the corner of the room. That's when she saw him. A man stood by the window, his back turned, his figure barely illuminated by the soft glow of the street lamp outside. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a hat that cast a long shadow over his face. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream but couldn't find her voice. She slid under the covers, trembling, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. But when she peeked out again, the man hadn't moved. He was still there, standing silently, as if watching something, or waiting. Terrified, Lily slipped out of bed and ran to her mother's room. She shook her awake, her voice a desperate whisper. "Mommy, there's a man in my room." At first, her mother thought it was just a nightmare. She stroked Lily's hair and reassured her. But when she saw the terror in her daughter's eyes, she knew something wasn't right. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed a flashlight and tiptoed down the hallway, with Lily close behind. They entered the room cautiously, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. To her relief, the man was gone. But as her eyes adjusted, she noticed something terrifying. Lily's window was open, rain blowing in, curtains flapping in the wind. Her heart sank. She had locked that window before bed. They checked the house, every door and window, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No sign of the man Lily had seen. That night they stayed in the same bed, doors locked, hearts pounding. A few weeks later they heard the news. A man had been arrested 2 streets away for breaking into homes, watching families as they slept. Lily's mother never told her, but she knew in her gut who had been standing in her daughter's room that night. Story number 5. The Witch's Cackle. It was an ordinary evening when Jenna and her husband, Mark, moved into their new house. The house box finally unpacked, Mark suggested they celebrate with a bottle of wine. As Jenna poured the glasses, Mark ventured into the basement to store some old tools. The basement was unfinished, cold, and slightly damp. Nothing too unusual for a house this old. As Mark flicked on the light, the bulb flickered before plunging him into total darkness. Annoyed, he fumbled for his phone to use its flashlight. But in the unsettling silence, something else caught his attention. A sound, faint but distinct, rose from the far corner of the basement. It was a laugh, a low, raspy cackle, like something straight out of a horror movie. Mark froze, the hairs on his arms standing on end. The sound grew louder, echoing through the cold basement air. It was unmistakable, a witch-like cackle. Mark's heart raced as his flashlight finally flicked on. He spun the light toward the noise, expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. The basement was empty. Only the old boiler stood in the corner, creaking like it always did. He bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind him. "Jenna, did you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Hear what?" she replied, holding out a glass of wine, oblivious to his fear. The laugh, that creepy, witchy laugh, it was coming from the basement. Jenna raised an eyebrow, amused. "The house is old, Mark. It's probably just the pipes." Mark wasn't convinced. He had heard something down there. Days passed, but the thought of the cackle haunted him. Determined to find an explanation, he called a plumber to check for strange noises. The plumber found nothing unusual, but just as he was about to leave, the light in the basement went out again. And then, the laugh returned. This time, the plumber heard it too, clear as day. Yeah, the plumber stammered, backing away. "I think you've got more than just old pipes down there." The cackle was never explained, and from that night forward, neither Mark nor Jenna ever set foot in the basement again. Story number 6. The hidden stranger Alex, a college student juggling part-time work and classes, was struggling with calculus. He hired a tutor, Rebecca, who came highly recommended by his friends. She lived alone in a small apartment not far from campus. Every Tuesday night, Alex would go to her place for their tutoring sessions. One cold evening, things felt a bit off as soon as he walked into her apartment. Rebecca was friendly as always, but Alex couldn't shake the strange feeling creeping over him. The apartment felt darker, colder, and for some reason he kept hearing faint creaking sounds as if someone was shifting their weight in the room. As they sat on the floor reviewing equations, Alex noticed something odd. The blanket draped over Rebecca's bed seemed to move slightly. At first he brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just the breeze from the open window. But then, it happened again, this time more pronounced, as if someone was under there. Heart pounding, Alex tried to focus on the lesson, but curiosity got the better of him. "Rebecca, do you have a pet or something?" he asked, glancing nervously at the bed. She looked confused. "No, why?" Alex pointed to the bed. "I think something's moving under there." Rebecca's face went pale. Without a word, she stood up and cautiously approached the bed. She knelt down, grabbing the edge of the blanket with trembling fingers, and pulled it up in one swift motion. Both of them froze in horror. A man, disheveled and gaunt, was lying underneath the bed, staring right back at them. His eyes were wild, and he immediately tried to scramble out, but Alex grabbed a chair and blocked his way. Rebecca screamed, running to call the police as Alex kept his eyes on the intruder. When the police arrived and took the man away, they found out that he was a homeless man who had been sneaking into the building for months. He had somehow found his way into Rebecca's apartment and had been secretly living under her bed for nearly 2 weeks. He would leave when she went to work and return when she wasn't looking. Rebecca, shaken, moved out the next day. And Alex never forgot the haunting realization that sometimes you're not as alone as you think. Story number 7. The ambush in Amboy Jake Simmons was a Marine who had seen his fair share of action. After serving multiple tours overseas, he had learned to trust his instincts. It was a quiet Sunday evening when he was driving down a deserted highway in Amboy, a small ghost town in the middle of the Mojave Desert. He was heading back to base after visiting family when something strange caught his attention. Up ahead, he saw an old pickup truck stopped in the middle of the road. The hood was up, and a man was waving for help. Jake's military training kicked in immediately. Something wasn't right. There was no traffic on this stretch of road, and the nearest town was miles away. The scene felt staged. Slowing down as he approached the truck, Jake noticed something even more unsettling. There were fresh tire tracks leading off into the desert, barely visible in the fading light. He kept his distance and observed the man from inside his vehicle. The man continued waving, but Jake could see no urgency in his movements. His clothes were clean, too clean for someone supposedly stranded in the desert. Jake's heart began to race. He scanned the area and spotted a second figure hiding behind a cluster of rocks off to the side of the road. That was all the confirmation he needed. This was an ambush, and he wasn't going to fall for it. Instead of stopping, Jake revved his engine and veered off the road, driving around the truck and keeping his foot on the gas. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man who had been hiding jump out, clearly frustrated that his plan had failed. Jake drove for miles without looking back. When he finally got to the next town, he stopped at a diner and reported the incident to local authorities. Later that week, he learned that another driver hadn't been so lucky. A car had been found abandoned on the same stretch of road, and the driver was still missing. To this day, Jake thanks his training and his instincts for saving his life that night in Amboy. What could have ended in tragedy became a chilling reminder. Not all dangers come from battlefields. Sometimes they hide in plain sight on quiet, deserted roads. Story number 8. The Screams by the River. It was supposed to be just another peaceful night of fishing by the river. A group of old friends had gathered by the banks of the secluded Hollow Creek, a spot they'd been visiting since their teenage years. The sun had long set, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the water as their lines bobbed quietly in the current. The night was calm, save for the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. They sat around, sharing stories and laughter, reminiscing about their younger days. But as the evening wore on, an odd sense of unease began to settle over them. Around midnight, a piercing scream broke the stillness of the night. It wasn't an animal sound. They'd all heard the usual wildlife in the area over the years, but this was different. It was human. The scream echoed along the river, sending a chill through each of them. For a moment, they sat frozen, unsure if what they had just heard was real. Then it came again, louder this time, more desperate. A woman's voice, unmistakable now. She sounded terrified, and it seemed to be coming from the dense woods across the river. "Should we check it out?" one of them asked, though none of them wanted to move. "Maybe it's just someone playing a prank," another suggested, trying to dismiss the tension in the air. But then, the scream came again, followed by an unsettling silence. It was too real, too panicked to ignore. Grabbing their flashlights, the group cautiously made their way along the riverbank, the sound of their footsteps crunching against the gravel, mixing with the low rustle of the wind through the trees. When they reached the spot where the scream had seemed to come from, they found nothing. No signs of a person, no footprints, no movement. The forest was completely still. Just as they began to turn back, another scream rang out, this time impossibly from the other side of the river where they had been just moments ago. Fear gripped them as they realized there was no one to be found. The source of the screams remained a mystery. But that night, the friends packed up and left the river, never to return. To this day, no one knows who or what was crying out for help by Hollow Creek. Story number 9. The silent phone call. It was late in the evening when Emma realized her phone was missing. She had just come home from a night out with friends, and as she rummaged through her bag, panic set in. Her phone was gone. After checking her car, retracing her steps, and even calling the restaurant, she accepted that it must have slipped out somewhere along the way. Annoyed but calm, she borrowed her roommate's phone to call her own, hoping someone might pick it up. After a few rings, to her surprise, the call connected. "Hello?" Emma said, expecting to hear a good Samaritan on the other end, but it was silence there. "Hello? Can you hear me?" she asked, but still, no response. There was no noise, no background chatter, just an unsettling, heavy silence. Emma repeated herself, growing frustrated. "If you found my phone, please let me know. I just want it back." Still, there was no reply. She could hear faint breathing, but no one spoke. Feeling uneasy, she hung up and dialed again. This time, the call was answered immediately, but the silence was even more unnerving. The faint breathing was still there, but now it seemed deliberate, as if someone was trying to let her know they were listening closely, refusing to speak. Emma's pulse quickened, her hands shaking slightly. "Who is this? Please, if you found my phone, just say something." The call remained mute, and suddenly, the line went dead. Heart racing, she stared at the borrowed phone in disbelief. Her first thought was that it must be a prank. Maybe someone found her phone and thought it would be funny to mess with her, but something felt off. She couldn't shake the eerie feeling that whoever was on the other end wasn't playing a prank. There was an unsettling deliberateness to the silence. Deciding to report it to the authorities, she grabbed her things and got ready to leave. Just as she reached the front door, her landline phone began ringing. Startled, Emma froze. No one ever called her landline. It rang again, loud and insistent. She picked up the receiver and whispered, "Hello?" Once again, only silence greeted her, but this time it felt closer. Story number 10. The Neighbor's Dark Obsession. Sophie was a lively 6-year-old, full of energy and innocence, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood with her parents. They had just moved in a few months earlier, and everything seemed perfect. Their neighbors were friendly, the area was safe, and Sophie loved her new room, especially the spacious closet where she would often play with her dolls. But recently, Sophie started telling her parents strange things. "Mommy, the man in my closet watched me sleep again last night," she would say innocently. Her mother, assuming it was just a bad dream or Sophie's imagination running wild, would reassure her. "There's no one in your closet, sweetie. It's just a shadow." One night, Sophie's parents were having dinner when they heard a faint creaking noise from her room. Curious, her dad went upstairs to check on her. He found Sophie fast asleep, but something caught his attention. The closet door was slightly ajar. He was sure they always closed it before bed. Dismissing it, He gently closed the door again and kissed Sophie on the forehead before heading back downstairs. The following night, Sophie's mother tucked her in. As she turned off the lights, Sophie whispered, "Mommy, he's watching again." Chills ran down her spine, but she laughed it off. "You're safe here, baby. No one is watching you." But her daughter's words lingered in her mind. The real horror came a week later. Sophie's mother was cleaning her room while she was at school. As she was dusting the closet door, she noticed something odd. There were faint scratches on the inside of the closet door frame, as if someone had been pressing against it from the inside. Her heart pounded. But she told herself it must be old damage from a previous tenant. That night, Sophie refused to sleep in her room. "He's in there again," she whispered, terrified. This time, her father took her seriously. He opened the closet slowly, expecting to find nothing, just to prove there was no man. But there was something. A figure crouched in the corner. It was their neighbor, pale and wide-eyed, staring at them in eerie silence. He had been living inside their house, sneaking into Sophie's room at night, watching her sleep. The police arrived quickly, but the damage was done. The thought that someone had been hiding in their home for so long, feeding off their daughter's innocence, haunted them forever. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment down below, and share for more stories.
Story number 1. The Dark Closet. The night a shadow escaped. When I was a kid, around 7 years old, my family lived in an old 2-story house that had its quirks. My room, oddly enough, wasn't a traditional bedroom. It was more of a small space that connected to the attic. It was cramped, with low ceilings, and a closet that took up almost half the room. The closet itself was strange. It was elevated, and you had to climb a few steps to open its big, creaky sliding door. It wasn't just a place to hang clothes. It was stuffed with all sorts of toys, old boxes, and random bits of childhood clutter. Being up on my own little floor, separated from my family, always made me uneasy. The big closet loomed over my small bed, and I remember feeling a constant sense of unease, especially at night. It was after we watched a horror movie as a family that things really started to get weird. One night, as I lay in bed, my heart still racing from the scary movie, I heard a sound coming from the closet. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me freeze. It sounded like a toy had tumbled off a shelf. Terrified, I bolted out of bed and ran straight to my parents' room. My dad tried to calm me down, telling me it was just my imagination, but he let me stay in their room that night. The next night, I had almost forgotten about the noise when it happened again. This time louder. It was the distinct sound of Lego pieces spilling out of their container and scattering across the floor. I didn't hesitate. I dashed to my parents' room, insisting that something was in my closet. My dad, growing annoyed, told me to go back to bed, but my mom promised we'd check the closet together in the morning. When we finally opened the closet the next day, I expected to see something out of place, and there it was. A pile of Legos was scattered across the floor, just like I had heard. My mom brushed it off, saying they must have fallen on their own. I wasn't so sure, but I tried to believe her. That night, my dad locked his door. Tired of my stories, I lay in bed, my heart racing as I stared at the closet, dreading the next sound. The room was silent for what felt like hours, but then I heard it. The closet door slid open with a loud, deliberate creak. The moonlight that filtered through my window lit up the figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and shadowy, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me like never before. I screamed, a loud, desperate scream that echoed through the house. The figure suddenly leaped down from the closet and darted out of my room. My dad rushed downstairs, trying to catch whoever it was, but they were already gone. The police came, but they never found anyone. To this day, I still remember the feeling of that night, the fear, the confusion, and the haunting image of that figure standing in the moonlit doorway. And the worst part, we never figured out who or what was hiding in that closet. Story number 2. When the past returned. The man no one ever found. When I was in 8th grade, my school organized a trip called the Louisiana Tour, a week-long journey through historic locations in southern Louisiana. One stop stood out above the rest: Myrtle's Plantation, a place infamous for being one of the most haunted locations in America. While I had heard stories of ghostly sightings and strange occurrences, I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. That was until we entered one of the rooms on the tour. As the tour guide droned on, talking about the plantation's long history, something strange caught my attention. A faint, repetitive sound echoed in the distance. At first, I brushed it off, but it sounded almost like a single note being struck on a piano, over and over again. I glanced around the room, expecting to see a piano nearby, but there was none in sight. I nudged my friends, asking if they could hear the strange piano note. They shook their heads, looking at me like I was imagining things. Still, the sound persisted. Confused, I glanced around the room again, and that's when I noticed a woman standing on the other side of the group. She was staring right at me. When our eyes met, she raised her hand and pointed to her ear, mouthing the words, "Do you hear it too?" I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. We weren't imagining it. Something was definitely there. Just as this silent exchange was happening, the tour guide began telling a story. A soldier had once lived and died at the plantation, and it was said that his spirit would play the piano late at night. Many visitors had reported hearing piano music with no visible source, just like what I was hearing at that moment. My heart raced as I realized I might be experiencing the very thing I had dismissed as folklore. As the tour ended, I approached the woman who had signaled to me. She confirmed she had heard the same sound, but like me, no one else around her had noticed it. Her husband and son looked puzzled as she explained, and it left me wondering, was the soldier's ghost playing for us? Or was it all just in our heads? To this day, I'm not entirely sure what happened in that room, but I'll never forget that eerie, unexplainable moment at Myrtle's Plantation. Story number 3, Trapped in Terror. My nightmare came to life. It was just before Halloween when my friends and I gathered around a campfire, swapping ghost stories to set the eerie mood. One of my friends, Emily, hesitated when it was her turn to share. She warned us that the story she was about to tell wasn't your typical ghost tale. It was a true story about her parents' first date. Intrigued, we urged her to go on. Despite her reluctance, Emily's parents had a pleasant, albeit awkward, first date. After dinner, her dad had suggested they take a spontaneous midnight hike up Provo Canyon. He was familiar with the area, having spent many weekends rock climbing there. It seemed like the perfect way to extend the night under the blanket of stars. So they drove up to the canyon, parked, and started their hike, guided only by starlight, since there was no moon that night. As they ventured deeper into the canyon, Emily's dad began to feel uneasy. They were approaching a patch of trees, and something about the darkness ahead made him second-guess their adventure. But he brushed off the feeling and kept walking. A few minutes later, the uneasy feeling returned, stronger this time. Ignoring his gut instinct again, they pressed forward. Then, as they walked through the dark underbrush, Emily's dad suddenly tripped over something soft in the middle of the path. He stopped, trying to figure out what he had stumbled upon, but the darkness made it impossible to see. The feeling of dread that had been nagging at him intensified, and without saying much, both he and Emily's mom agreed it was time to leave. They turned around and hurried back to the car without looking back. Years later, after they were married, Emily's parents were watching a true crime documentary. The focus was on notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. During an interview, Bundy was asked to recount a time when he had almost been caught. Chillingly, he described a night when he had lured a young woman into Provo Canyon, killed her, and dragged her body onto the trail. He hid in the trees when he heard people approaching. He watched as Ahmad, Emily's dad, walked straight into the body, stopped, and for reasons Bundy couldn't understand, simply turned around and left. The realization that they had narrowly avoided such a horrifying fate still sends shivers down Emily's spine, and it left us all speechless by the fire that night. Story number 4, The Figure in the Moonlight, a haunting memory I can't shake. Last year, while cramming for a deadline, I found myself in my school's library well past 11 p.m. The library stays open until 2 a.m. for procrastinators like me, who wait until the last possible moment to finish their assignments. It's a small library, with most of the books stored in the basement, a section called the Stacks. The stacks are divided into 2 large rooms on opposite sides of a long hallway. There are study desks scattered throughout, tucked between rows of shelves. Since I had a research-heavy paper due for my 8 a.m. class, I set up at one of the study desks downstairs, hoping to save time from going up and down the stairs. Only one other student, a guy working a few desks down, was left in the room. By this point, I was pretty deep into my work, stressed but focused. That's when I heard it. Someone flipping through pages rapidly, making that unmistakable loud whipping sound. At first, I ignored it, thinking someone was skimming through a book in frustration. But after a few minutes, the noise persisted, growing increasingly irritating. Finally, I had enough. I got up to confront whoever was making the noise. But as soon as I took a few steps across the room, the sound abruptly stopped. Relieved, I sat back down, thinking it was over. But within 10 minutes, it started again, this time louder. It was as if they were flipping through a massive book now. I wasn't the only one getting annoyed. The guy a few desks over stood up and started searching the shelves, trying to find the source. The sound had gotten so loud that it was clear where it was coming from. I joined him in looking, but as we walked along the shelves, nobody was there. No one had entered the stacks, and given our positions near the entrances, no one could have left without us noticing. Confused, we both went back to our desks. I tried convincing myself it was just a malfunctioning fan, but my nerves were frayed. Just as we sat down, the noise erupted again. This time, it seemed to come from right next to the guy's chair. He grabbed his stuff in a panic, muttered something I couldn't catch, and bolted out of the room. I wasn't far behind. Since that night, I refused to step foot in the stacks alone, especially after dark. Story number 5. I saw him, but no one believed me. A few years ago, my wife and I embarked on a 2-day fishing trip off the North Atlantic, something we did regularly with my old fishing boat. The first day was pleasant. We made a decent catch, and in the evening, we enjoyed playing cards, listening to music, and taking in the peaceful atmosphere. But the next night changed everything. After a slow day on the water, we settled into our usual routine. This time without any music. It was quiet, just the hum of the boat and the sound of the ocean. Then out of nowhere, we heard the unmistakable sound of a boat motor. Startled, we rushed outside to see a small old motorboat heading directly for us. With no lights, moving slowly in the dark. As the boat approached, we saw a middle-aged man at the helm. He had a scruffy beard and wore a worn-out baseball cap. The boat came to a stop right in front of ours, and I called out to ask if he needed help. He mumbled something about needing spare gas, so I apologized, saying we didn't have any extra. But when I asked if he needed a ride back to shore, he refused and claimed he had plenty of fuel. This struck me as odd, Why would he ask for gas if he had enough? The air between us grew tense, and the man just stared blankly at me. I could only see him thanks to the faint glow of our deck light. The rest of the ocean was pitch black. The silence stretched for what felt like forever. The tension almost unbearable. Finally, he broke the silence and casually asked if we had caught anything that day. I told him we hadn't, still trying to remain polite despite the growing sense of dread. I asked him how he was navigating in the dark without any lights, but he just chuckled as if I'd told a joke. Without answering, he slowly began to move away, but just as he drifted into the darkness, he cut his engine. I could barely make out the outline of his boat, sitting still on the water, but I knew he was there, watching us. The uneasy feeling was overwhelming. We retreated inside the boat, locked the doors, and pulled the curtains shut. The next morning, the man and his boat were gone, as if they had never been there. I never returned to fish in that area again. Story number 6. The attic door that should have stayed shut. In the winter of 2005, during my junior year of high school, something happened that I'll never forget. It was a Friday night, and like most weekends, my friends and I had gathered to play video games. After a few hours, the boredom set in, so we decided to go for a drive, as we often did. Matt was driving. Eric sat up front in the passenger seat, while Ryan and I were in the back. We had just dropped our friend Billy off at his house, and were heading back to Matt's place, driving down a familiar road. We'd driven this stretch countless times before, so nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As we rounded a curve and hit a long, straight section of the road, we saw something up ahead. There, in the middle of the road, stood a man, completely still, his arms hanging at his sides. He was about 150 yards away, and as we got closer, Matt flipped on his high beams. The man didn't move an inch, but now we could see him more clearly. He wore faded jeans, a red plaid jacket, and a camouflage baseball cap. What struck me most, though, were his eyes. They seemed to glow unnaturally in the darkness, reflecting the headlights like an animal's would. Matt slowed the car to a stop for what felt like several minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. We all just stared at the man in stunned silence. He stared back, completely motionless, not even flinching. The eerie stillness hung in the air. No one in the car said a word, but we were all thinking the same thing. Something about this wasn't right. Then, without warning, the man bolted. He sprinted off to our left, vanishing into the woods at full speed. Matt floored the gas pedal, and we sped away, hearts racing and adrenaline pumping. When we got back to Matt's house, the conversation erupted. We all agreed on one thing. Those eyes weren't normal. They seemed to glow in a way none of us could explain. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the headlights reflecting weirdly. But the more I think about it, the less certain I am. That night, something beyond the ordinary happened, and it still gives me chills to this day. Story number 7. Legos, lurking shadows, and a secret in the closet. About a week ago, my friend asked me to pick up a new vape for him. The shop was a 20-minute walk away, and since my phone was dead, I decided to go alone. The walk there was uneventful, and I managed to get the vape without any issues. However, the walk back was a completely different story. As I was heading home, I passed a group of people arguing loudly. At first, I didn't pay much attention to them. I figured it was just some random fight, so I kept walking. But suddenly, one of them grabbed me. I'll never forget the way he looked at me. Intense, almost threatening. He was wearing a black jacket with a gray hoodie, and his eyes locked onto mine as he said, "You heard what we were talking about, didn't you?" I hadn't heard a thing, so I quickly responded, "No, I didn't." But he wasn't buying it. "You sure about that? You look like you heard something." I was starting to panic. His grip on my arm tightened, and it felt like he was about to break it. He leaned in closer, his voice low and threatening. "You better not say a word, or we're going to do something about it." Terrified, I managed to pull away and started walking as fast as I could. I could hear them yelling after me, but I didn't dare look back. My heart was racing, and I just focused on getting home as quickly as possible. When I finally made it back, I told my friend everything. The whole experience left me shaken, and I haven't gone outside without my phone since then. It's crazy how something so normal, like a quick walk to the store, can turn into a nightmare in a matter of seconds. Story number 8. My childhood fear was real. The man who hid in our house. Late one night, I was relaxing in my living room, watching TV, when a sudden, loud thud came from the kitchen. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it might be the ice machine or something minor, but then the sound came again. Louder, more unsettling. I muted the TV and listened closely. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Nervous, I got up to check. The kitchen was empty, nothing out of place. I inspected the doors and windows. They were locked tight. Trying to calm myself, I figured it was just the house settling and went back to the living room. Not 5 minutes later, the sound returned, this time coming from the hallway near my bedroom. My heart started pounding. Grabbing a kitchen knife for protection, I slowly made my way down the hall. As soon as I reached my bedroom door, the sound stopped abruptly. With a deep breath, I pushed open the door with my foot and scanned the room. Nothing. No one was there. I checked under the bed, in the closet, and even in the bathroom. Everything was empty. The silence was deafening. Feeling uneasy, I turned on every light in the house and stayed awake the rest of the night. But the noise never came again. At least not that night. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, I've heard the same disturbing sound twice more. Always in the dead of night. Always just before I'm about to head to bed. Each time, it feels more unnerving. Like whatever is making the noise is lurking, waiting for something. I still can't explain it, but the feeling that I'm not alone in my own home has only grown stronger. Whatever it is, it's watching, and I can't shake the fear that one night I'll find out what or who has been causing those sounds. Story number 9. From Closet to Chaos. A haunting I'll never forget. A few years ago, I was driving home late at night after spending the evening at my girlfriend's place. It was around 1 a.m., and I was on a desolate stretch of rural road with no streetlights and barely any traffic. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around me, and the only sound was the hum of my car's engine. I was tired but alert, eyes scanning the road as I just wanted to get home. Up ahead, something caught my attention. A figure standing by the side of the road. As I approached, I realized it was a woman. She was wearing a long, white dress that almost seemed to glow in the darkness. Her bare feet were planted firmly on the ground, and her head was bowed, with long hair cascading over her face, completely obscuring it. I slowed down, my instincts telling me to see if she needed help. But as I passed her, she didn't move. Not a single flinch. She didn't even look up, as if she wasn't aware of my presence at all. It was eerie, but I chalked it up to her possibly being drunk or disoriented. I didn't stop. However, a quick glance in my rearview mirror made my heart race. The woman had stepped into the middle of the road, right where I had just driven past. She was walking slowly, her figure fading into the distance behind me. My pulse quickened, and I pressed the gas, not daring to stop again. The unsettling image of her standing alone in the dark lingered in my mind the rest of the way home. Even now, I still think about that night. Who was she? What was she doing out there, all alone in the middle of nowhere at that hour? The questions have never left me, and I'll probably never know, but that chilling encounter remains etched in my memory. Let's get to the last story of the day. Story number 10. Screams in the Dark. The night I met a stranger in my room. Last winter, I went camping with a group of friends in the mountains, confident in our skills as seasoned campers. The forecast warned of a chilly night, but we shrugged it off, excited for an adventure. After setting up camp and enjoying a hearty dinner, we gathered around the crackling fire, sharing stories and sipping on drinks. Laughter echoed through the trees as we swapped ghost tales. But as the night wore on, the temperature dropped faster than expected. Soon, we were exhaling clouds of mist, our breaths visible in the freezing air. Despite our warm layers, the cold seeped through, sending shivers down our spines. Eventually, we decided to retreat to our tents for some much-needed rest. I shared a tent with my friend Dave, and as we settled in, the quiet of the forest enveloped us. Suddenly we heard it, footsteps crunching through the snow outside our tent. At first, we assumed it was just an animal, but the sound was heavy and purposeful, unlike anything we'd encountered in the wilderness before. Our hearts raced, and we held our breath, straining to listen. The footsteps drew closer, stopping just outside our tent. We exchanged glances, wide-eyed, our instincts screaming at us to remain silent. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we waited, frozen in place. Then, without warning, the footsteps retreated into the darkness, moving away from our campsite and toward the depths of the woods. The tension in the air was palpable. We were too unnerved to sleep. The morning sun finally broke through the trees, casting a warm glow over our campsite. As we stepped outside, we quickly scanned the ground for any signs of the visitor from the night before. To our horror, there were no tracks, none at all, except for our own footprints leading from the campfire to our tents. A chill ran down my spine as we gathered for breakfast, sharing our unnerving experience. We all felt it, the presence in the night, an unseen stranger lurking just beyond the light. We packed up our camp, the eerie memory haunting us as we hiked back to the car, forever questioning what or who had wandered so close while we slept. Thanks for the watching. Please like, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. Story number 1. The Stranger Behind the Couch. A terrifying night alone when my cousin Jeremy was just 12 years old. Something happened to him that he refuses to talk about in detail, but it's obvious it left a deep mark. It's a story that has haunted our family for years, especially when the topic comes up late at night. One evening, Jeremy was home alone. His parents had gone to dinner, and he had the house to himself. It was the early 90s, and he was watching TV in the family room, a clunky old box TV that often had signal issues. Suddenly the screen flickered and turned off. Annoyed, but not concerned, Jeremy got up and turned it back on manually, assuming it was just a glitch. But the moment he sat down again, the TV shut off once more. This strange cycle continued a few more times, but when Jeremy stood up to investigate, something felt off. He started looking for the remote, thinking it might have fallen under the couch or gotten stuck somewhere. As he knelt down to check behind the couch, Jeremy froze. There, crouched in the corner, was a man. He had disheveled hair and wore a wild expression that Jeremy would later describe as unhinged. The man was holding the TV remote in his hand, and when he noticed Jeremy, he gave him a unsettling grin. Jeremy was paralyzed for a split second, but panic took over. He bolted out of the house, screaming louder than he ever had before. He didn't stop running until he reached the neighbor's house. Thankfully, they called the police, and by the time officers arrived, the man was still inside, calmly sitting in the family room. The police arrested the man, who appeared disoriented and likely homeless. Jeremy's family never found out how he got into the house, but the story still sends shivers down my spine. Even now, Jeremy refuses to watch TV alone at night. Story number 2, The Shadow Behind the Door. When my friend Ava was a young girl, she encountered a frightening experience that still haunts her to this day. Around the age of 9, she was excitedly walking home from school, clutching her backpack and daydreaming about her favorite snacks. Her mother, a single parent, worked long hours, often returning home after Ava had settled in for the evening. As she approached the front door of their modest house, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. Thinking her mother had forgotten to close it properly, she pushed it open and stepped inside. To her surprise, there stood her mother in a fluffy robe, looking pale and weary. Ava thought her mom must have taken a sick day, so she greeted her with a bright smile. However, before Ava could finish her sentence, her mother turned sharply, her eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" she demanded, staring directly past Ava. Confused, Ava turned around to see a shadowy figure in a long coat, swiftly retreating down the street. The man seemed to vanish into the growing darkness. As he hurried away, Ava's heart raced. She felt a chill creep up her spine as her mother moved towards her, pulling her close. "You shouldn't have opened the door. I didn't expect you home so soon," her mother whispered, her voice trembling. They quickly locked the door and checked the windows, ensuring that every entrance was secure. Later that evening, as they sat together on the couch, a sense of unease lingered in the air. Ava couldn't shake the image of the man from her mind, and her mother's worried glances didn't help either. They watched the news, and there it was, a report about a recent string of attempted break-ins in their neighborhood. That incident left a mark on both of them. Ava realized that her mother's instincts had saved her from a potentially dangerous encounter, and she never again took the safety of her home for granted. Story number 3, The Hand at the Door. Emily was just a teenager, but her life had already been marked by chaos. Her mother struggled with addiction, often leaving Emily to fend for herself. Her father, a hard-working man, tried to provide stability, but the strain was palpable. One stormy night, everything changed. Emily was asleep in her room when she was jolted awake by a series of loud thuds and scratching noises coming from her mother's bedroom. Heart racing, she heard her father's frantic footsteps as he dashed down the hallway. "What's going on?" Emily called out, but her voice was swallowed by the sound of banging. Her father pounded on the door, demanding to know what was happening inside. "Go back to sleep," her mother shouted from the other side, her voice slurred. The door finally creaked open, revealing her mother, disheveled and dazed, with no memory of the noise. Confused, her father glanced around the room, only to find the window wide open, rain pouring in. The television had been pushed across the floor, facing the outside. Fearing the worst, her father quickly locked the door and made her mother sleep on the couch in the living room. They sat together in silence, the storm raging outside, mirroring their anxiety. As the hours ticked by, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Just before dawn, Emily's father heard a peculiar shuffling noise above them, almost like footsteps on the roof. He turned to Emily, placing a finger to his lips, and they waited, breathless, until the sound finally faded away. But their relief was short-lived. Later that morning, while they were gathering their things to leave, Emily spotted something that would haunt her forever. In the hallway, at the door of an unused room, a pale finger emerged, wrapping around the edge as if beckoning her to come closer. "Dad!" she screamed, her voice trembling. He rushed to her side, and they both stared in horror as the finger slowly retreated back into the darkness of the room. Panic surged through them, and without a moment's hesitation, they fled the house. Heart pounding, they drove to a nearby gas station, trembling and waiting for Emily's grandmother to pick them up. That day, they left everything behind, never to return to that haunted house where the past lurked in every shadow. Story number 4, The Shadow on the Edge. When Mia was 13, she lived in an old house that had seen better days. It was her sanctuary, but also a place filled with eerie memories. Her bedroom was on the top floor, isolated from the rest of the house, which often left her feeling vulnerable and anxious, especially at night. With her parents' room far below, she was used to the silence that wrapped around her like a blanket, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. One rainy evening, Mia decided to finish a book she had been reading. The clock struck 2 in the morning, and she began to feel a sense of unease creeping in. The sound of rain tapping against her window made her heart race, but she brushed it off. However, as she settled into bed, she noticed something unusual. A dark shadow creeping along the edge of her bed. Her heart skipped a beat, and she blinked hard to dispel the image, convinced it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But then the shadow shifted. A rush of adrenaline coursed through her as she realized it wasn't just a trick of the light. She felt a cold draft brush against her skin, and panic set in. Gathering her courage, she flipped on her bedside lamp, illuminating the room in a warm glow. But the shadow vanished, leaving her alone with the sound of her pounding heart. Half an hour passed, and just as she began to relax, she noticed it again. This time, the shadow was closer, hovering at the foot of her bed. Trembling, Mia reached down for her water bottle, desperate for something to ground her. Instead, her hand brushed against something icy cold. Confused, she turned on the lamp again, but this time, her blood ran cold. A figure stood there, a man peering over the edge of her bed, his face obscured by the darkness. Mia screamed, a sound that echoed through the empty halls of the house, and bolted for the door, adrenaline pushing her forward. The man's hand reached out, trying to grab her, but she slipped past him and down the stairs, her heart racing with fear. Her parents were startled, awake as she burst into their room, breathless and wide-eyed. They rushed to her room, only to find it empty. The window opened to the storm outside. From that night on, the memory of the shadow haunted Mia, a reminder that sometimes the darkness hides more than just silence. Story number 5, The Last Call. In a small suburban town, 16-year-old Ben was home alone on a stormy night while his parents were out at a family gathering. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of their old house, while rain lashed against the roof. Ben settled into the living room with his favorite video game, hoping to distract himself from the brewing storm. As the night wore on, the sound of thunder intensified and the power flickered. Just as he leaned back to take a break, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. He cursed under his breath and reached for his phone to call his parents. But to his surprise, there was no signal. With a sigh, he grabbed a flashlight from a nearby drawer and made his way to the kitchen to find some candles. As he rummaged through the drawers, his phone buzzed unexpectedly. A notification popped up. Unknown caller. Thinking it was just a spam call, he ignored it. But just as he was about to light a candle, the phone buzzed again. This time he hesitated. Curiosity got the better of him, and he answered. "Hello," he said, his voice shaky. "Help me," a voice whispered. barely audible over the crackling line. Ben's heart raced. I'm trapped. Who is this? He asked, feeling a cold sweat to break out across his forehead. Just look behind you, the voice replied. Chills ran down his spine as he slowly turned, shining his flashlight into the dark corners of the room. For a moment, he saw nothing, just shadows dancing on the walls. He was about to dismiss it as a prank when he felt a cold breath on his neck. Ben spun around, heart racing, but found only empty air. Panic surged through him as he backed away toward the front door, clutching the phone tightly. The call had dropped, but the fear lingered. The candle he'd just lit flickered ominously, casting erratic shadows around the room. Just then, his phone buzzed again, and he glanced down to see another notification. Unknown caller. With shaking hands, he answered once more. Who is this? He demanded. Look outside, the voice hissed, eerily calm. Against his better judgment, he approached the window, heart pounding in his chest. As he peered through the rain-smeared glass, he felt his stomach drop. There, illuminated by a flash of lightning, stood a figure wearing a long coat, staring directly at him. In that instant, Ben understood. He wasn't alone after all. He dropped the phone and bolted for the door, fear propelling him forward. He fled into the stormy night, desperate to escape whatever horror awaited him inside the house. From that night on, he never returned to that place, forever haunted by the voice on the line and the shadow waiting just outside. Story number 6, The Hiker's Shadow. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, a group of friends decided to embark on a weekend camping trip. Among them was Mia, a spirited adventurer with a love for the great outdoors. As they set up their tents near a serene lake, the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the campsite. The group gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. As the night grew darker, Mia, feeling restless, suggested a night hike to explore a nearby trail. Her friends hesitated, but the allure of the moonlit forest was too tempting to resist. Armed with flashlights, they set off down the winding path, the sounds of the forest enveloping them. As they walked, they told ghost stories, their laughter echoing in the stillness. But soon the mood shifted. An unsettling feeling hung in the air. After about an hour, they decided to turn back. But as they retraced their steps, Mia noticed something strange. A shadow seemed to follow them, lurking just beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. She mentioned it to her friends, but they brushed it off as paranoia. However, the sensation of being watched intensified, gnawing at the edges of her mind. When they reached the campsite, relief washed over them. They settled around the fire, trying to shake off the unease. But as they began to relax, Mia glanced back at the trail. The shadowy figure stood at the tree line, unmoving. Panic coursed through her veins, and she alerted her friends, who finally turned to see what she was pointing at. What is that? Alex, one of the friends, whispered, squinting into the darkness. They all stood frozen, watching the figure slowly step forward into the light. It was a man, his clothes tattered and dirty, with wild hair and a crazed look in his eyes. A primal fear gripped them as they realized he was not just a lost hiker. He was staring at them with an unsettling smile. In a frantic rush, they scrambled to pack their things. The man took a step closer, and without thinking, Mia grabbed her backpack and sprinted toward the road, her friends following suit. They ran until they reached the car, breathless and terrified. As they sped away, glancing back at the dark forest, Mia felt a chill settle over her. They never spoken of that night again, but the image of that man, lurking just beyond the firelight, haunted her dreams. From that day on, whenever she hiked, She always felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows, a reminder that not all wanderers belong to the light. Story number 7. The Watcher in the Woods. It was a chilly October evening when 12-year-old Sam decided to go camping in the woods behind his grandparents' house. His family had always shared stories of the forest, filled with tales of adventure and hidden treasures. But there were also whispers of strange occurrences and things that went bump in the night. Sam, however, was excited to make his own memories. He set up his small tent near a creek, the gentle sound of water easing his nerves. As darkness pulled, he lit a small fire and roasted marshmallows, savoring the warm glow and the crackling of the flames. After a while, he felt an unsettling sensation creeping in, the feeling of being watched. Shaking it off, he tried to focus on his surroundings, recalling stories about the local wildlife. Suddenly, the quiet rustling of leaves caught his attention. Peering into the darkness, he thought he saw a figure dart between the trees. Curiosity piqued, he called out, "Hello?" But only silence answered him. His heart raced, but he brushed it off as his imagination playing tricks. As the night deepened, the feeling of unease intensified. Sam decided to turn in, zipping himself into his sleeping bag, but sleep eluded him. He kept hearing faint whispers, like the wind carrying distant voices. Just as he was about to drift off, a loud thud against the side of the tent jolted him awake. Terrified, he held his breath, listening intently. Then came a low, raspy voice from outside. "Let me in, Sam." Panic surged through him. He knew that voice wasn't his grandfather's or his grandmother's. With trembling hands, he reached for his flashlight, shining it toward the tent entrance. Outside stood a figure, cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. "Please, I'm lost. Help me," it whispered again, a twisted grin forming beneath the darkness. Sam's instincts kicked in, and without a second thought, he grabbed his backpack and bolted through the opposite side of the tent. He ran blindly into the woods, branches scratching at his arms, heart pounding like a drum. After what felt like an eternity, he stumbled onto the road where his grandparents' house stood. He didn't stop running until he reached their front porch, gasping for breath. The night behind him, swallowing the darkness whole. From that night on, Sam never camped alone again, haunted by the memory of the voice that called to him in the woods, a chilling reminder that not everything lost is meant to be found. Story number 8. The Dark Reflection. When Mia was 12, her family moved into an old Victorian house in a quaint town known for its rich history. It was the kind of house that sparked curiosity and excitement, with creaking floors, hidden nooks, and an attic full of forgotten treasures. However, there was one particular item in the house that Mia found especially intriguing: a large, ornate mirror that hung in the hallway. The mirror had an antique frame, adorned with intricate carvings, and it seemed to absorb the light around it. Mia was drawn to it, spending hours admiring her reflection. But as the days passed, she began to notice something strange. Whenever she looked into the mirror, she could see shadows moving behind her, even when the hallway was empty. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of the light or her imagination, but as the occurrences grew more frequent, her unease deepened. One night, after brushing her teeth, Mia found herself staring into the mirror once more. This time, the shadows seemed to take form, swirling and twisting as if they were alive. She gasped, feeling an inexplicable pull to step closer. That's when she saw it, a dark figure standing just behind her reflection, its features indistinct but unmistakably menacing. Paralyzed with fear, Mia turned around, but the hallway was empty. Heart racing, she spun back to the mirror, only to find that the figure had moved closer, now directly beside her. Panicking, she grabbed a towel and flung it over the mirror, hoping to block whatever was lurking behind the glass. That night, she barely slept, haunted by visions of the shadowy figure. The following day, Mia decided to tell her parents, but they dismissed her fears as childhood imagination. Feeling alone, she took matters into her own hands. That evening, she confronted the mirror once more, peeking beneath the towel. To her horror, the figure was gone, but a chilling whisper echoed through the hallway. "You can't hide from me." Mia couldn't take it anymore. She begged her parents to get rid of the mirror, and they reluctantly agreed. The moment it left the house, the atmosphere lifted. But late at night, when she lay in bed, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her from the shadows, waiting for the chance to return. Story number 9. The Whispering Woods. When Marco was 14, his family relocated to a rural town surrounded by thick, ominous woods. The local kids warned him about the Whispering Woods, where strange sounds were said to echo at night, and mysterious figures roamed among the trees. Dismissing their stories as mere folklore, Marco decided to explore the woods one evening, eager to prove he wasn't afraid. As dusk settled, he slipped out of the house and ventured into the forest, armed only with a flashlight. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted like gnarled fingers, reaching for the sky. Marco's heart raced, but he pressed on, the thrill of adventure overpowering his fear. As he wandered deeper, he began to hear soft whispers weaving through the air, like hushed conversations just out of reach. He halted, his skin prickling with unease. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, urging him to come closer. "Follow us," they seemed to beckon, echoing through the trees. Against his better judgment, Marco followed the sound, convinced it was just a trick of the wind. But as he moved further, the whispers shifted into a chorus of desperate cries. Panic surged within him. He turned to leave, but the path behind him had vanished, swallowed by the darkness. Frantically, he shined his flashlight around, but the beam flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced in the underbrush. Just then, he spotted something. Figures emerging from the shadows, their features distorted and unnatural. They moved toward him, their mouths forming silent screams, as if pleading for help. Terrified, Marco stumbled backward, tripping over roots and scrambling to escape. The whispers intensified, filling his ears with an overwhelming cacophony. Just when he thought he would be consumed by the shadows, he broke through the tree line and collapsed onto the road, gasping for breath. His heart pounding, he glanced back at the woods, the whispers fading into the night. Marco never spoke of what he encountered in the Whispering Woods, but he could never shake the feeling that something dark still lurked within, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close. Story number 10. The Stranger in the Reflection. Sophie had always been fascinated by old things, especially the antique mirror that hung in her grandmother's attic. It was ornate, with intricate carvings and a glass surface that seemed to shimmer with a life of its own. The moment she discovered it, she felt an inexplicable connection, as if the mirror were calling her name. One rainy afternoon, while her parents were out running errands, Sophie decided to explore the attic. The moment she stepped inside, a chill swept through the room, sending shivers down her spine. She approached the mirror, brushing away layers of dust to reveal the reflection within. But when she looked closely, she noticed something strange. Her own reflection smiled back at her, even though she hadn't smiled. Confused, Sophie stepped back, only to see her reflection tilt its head to the side, mimicking her movements with a chilling precision. Heart pounding, she convinced herself it was just her imagination. But the reflection wasn't done with her yet. That night, as the storm raged outside, Sophie lay in bed, unable to shake off the unease that settled over her. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the attic, jolting her awake. Curiosity piqued. She crept out of her room and made her way up the stairs. As she entered the attic, she saw the mirror glowing faintly, illuminating the space with an otherworldly light. To her horror, her reflection was no longer mimicking her. It was staring back, grinning maliciously. Sophie felt a pull, a sinister urge to reach out and touch the glass. But just as she approached, a force surged through the mirror, and her reflection reached out as if trying to escape its confines. Panic gripped her, and she stumbled backward, realizing she was no longer alone. Shadows danced around her, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. Terrified, Sophie bolted out of the attic, never looking back. The next morning, the mirror was gone. Shattered pieces littered the floor. Her grandmother later told her it was an old family heirloom, rumored to trap lost souls. Sophie never spoke of that night, but she always felt the shadows watching, lurking just beyond her sight, waiting for the chance to return. Thanks for the watching. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, comment below, and share it with friends and family.